The wooden spoon scrapes against the bottom of an empty pot. In a longhouse somewhere in 9th century Norway, a Viking mother stares into the dying embers of her cooking fire. Outside, winter howls like a hungry wolf. Inside, her 3 children sleep fitfully, their stomachs echoing the hollow sound of that empty pot. This is not the Viking story you know. Forget the gleaming axes and dragon-headed ships. Forget the tales of warriors drinking mead in golden halls. The real Viking story begins with a simple, terrifying question that haunted every Norse household. What will we eat tomorrow? In the year 845 CE, a Viking named Ragnar might have terrorised Paris, but back home in Denmark, his wife faced a more deadly enemy than any Frankish army. Winter, the great killer that claimed more Viking lives than all their battles combined. And the only weapons against this enemy were knowledge, cunning, and an iron determination to waste absolutely nothing. The archaeological truth is stunning. In the frozen ground of abandoned Viking settlements, scientists have found the remains of meals so humble, so carefully rationed, that they reveal a people living on the knife's edge between survival and starvation. These were not the feasts of legend. These were the desperate calculations of families who understood that every grain of barley, every scrap of fat, every fragment of bone could mean the difference between life and death. Consider the morning routine in a typical Norse farmstead. Before dawn, the household's most important person wasn't the warrior father or the wise grandmother. It was whoever controlled the cooking pot. Usually a woman, she held the power of life and death in her calloused hands. Her knowledge of rationing, of stretching ingredients, of transforming scraps into sustenance, determined whether her family would see spring. The day began with porridge. Not the rich, creamy dish we might imagine, but a thin gruel made from precious barley mixed with water. If the family was fortunate, a tiny amount of butter might be stirred in. If times were truly desperate, even pine bark might be ground up and added to make the meagre portion seem larger. This wasn't just breakfast. It was often the only hot meal of the day. But here's where the Viking survival story becomes fascinating. These weren't helpless people slowly starving. They were masters of food science, developing techniques that modern nutritionists still admire. They understood that barley contained everything needed to keep a human being alive. They knew which wild plants provided vitamin C to prevent scurvy. They had figured out how to extract every possible calorie from every possible source. The Vikings discovered something remarkable. Survival wasn't about having the most food, it was about wasting the least. When a goat died, whether from slaughter or accident, the family faced a critical 24 hours. In a world without refrigeration, spoilage meant disaster, but the Vikings had developed a system so efficient it would impress modern chefs. Nothing, absolutely nothing, went unused. The meat was carved away, and either eaten immediately or preserved through smoking and salting. The blood was collected in wooden bowls, precious liquid that would become blood sausage, packed with nutrients that could sustain life for weeks. The bones were cracked open with iron hammers, the marrow extracted and boiled into rich soups. Even the intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings. The hide became leather, the hooves yielded glue. This wasn't waste management. This was alchemy, transforming death into life, scarcity into survival. The most revealing discoveries come from the garbage heaps of Viking settlements. Modern archaeologists sifting through thousand-year-old refuse have found something amazing. Bones that have been cracked, boiled, dried and cracked again. Some show evidence of being processed 3 or 4 times, each step extracting a little more nutrition. These aren't the remains of a single meal. They're evidence of a systematic approach to survival that stretched resources beyond their apparent limits. But perhaps the most heartbreaking evidence comes from the smallest bones, Excavations at Viking sites regularly uncover the remains of sparrows, mice, even insects that had been cooked and eaten. When archaeologists first found these tiny bones mixed with human food waste, they assumed they were accidental inclusions. Further study revealed the truth. In the depths of winter, when larger game was gone and stored food was running low, Viking families survived by eating anything that could provide a single calorie of energy. The children learned early. By age 5, a Viking child could identify which mushrooms were safe to eat, which seaweeds could be gathered from the shore, which tree barks could be ground into emergency flour. This wasn't formal education, it was survival training that began as soon as a child could walk. The songs and stories that entertained them were filled with lessons about food, which berries to pick, how to tell when meat had spoiled, why certain combinations of foods could keep you healthy through the dark months. The stakes were absolute. Archaeological evidence from Iceland's early settlements shows what happened when these survival systems failed. Entire families have been found buried together, their bones showing clear signs of malnutrition. These weren't victims of violence or disease. They were casualties of winter, people who had exhausted their food supplies and their knowledge, and found both insufficient. Yet here's the paradox that makes the Viking survival story so compelling. The same people who carefully rationed single grains of barley through winter were capable of extraordinary generosity when fortune smiled. Summer raids that brought back plunder weren't just about gold and silver, they were about salt, grain and preserved foods that could carry a community through another killing winter. The Vikings understood something that modern abundance has made us forget. Food isn't just fuel, it's hope. It's the promise of tomorrow. And in the harsh arithmetic of survival, hope had to be carefully measured, carefully preserved, and carefully shared. The sound that struck terror into every Viking heart wasn't the war cry of enemies or the crash of thunder. It was silence, the silence of an empty storehouse in the depths of February, when the last of the preserved fish had been eaten and spring lay months away like a distant dream. But this is where the Viking story becomes extraordinary, because what they did next separated survivors from victims. In the archaeological record, the winter of 976 CE stands out like a scar across Viking history. Tree ring data shows it was one of the coldest on record. Ice covered the seas so completely that no ships could move between settlements. Supply lines that communities depended on simply vanished. Yet many Viking families not only survived this killer winter, they emerged stronger. Their secret wasn't magic. It was knowledge so precise, so hard-won, that it had been passed down through generations like sacred texts. They knew things about food that most modern people have forgotten. They knew that seaweed wasn't just something that washed up on beaches. It was medicine. The Vikings had identified dozens of varieties, each with different nutritional properties. Some provided salt when none could be traded for. Others prevented the tooth loss and weakness that came with months of eating only grain. The most valuable varieties were dried and stored like treasure, because they could keep a person healthy when everything else had been exhausted. Archaeological excavations along the Norwegian coast have revealed seaweed storage systems that rival modern industrial facilities. Carefully constructed drying racks, underground storage chambers designed to keep dried seaweed fresh for years, even specialised tools for harvesting specific varieties at optimal times. This wasn't casual foraging. This was systematic exploitation of marine resources that required deep understanding of tides, seasons, and ocean ecology. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came from the most unlikely source: waste. When archaeologists began studying Viking Age latrines, they expected to find basic information about diet and health. Instead, they discovered evidence of a survival system so sophisticated it bordered on miraculous. The preserved remains of human waste from the winter of 976 contained seeds, plant fragments, and other materials that told an incredible story. During that terrible winter, Viking families had eaten everything, literally everything. They had ground pine bark into flour and mixed it with their dwindling grain supplies. They had processed leather into edible gelatin. They had collected and cooked every weed, every wild plant, every remotely digestible material they could find. But they had done it systematically, with knowledge passed down through generations about what was safe, what was nutritious, and what combinations could keep a human being alive. The most stunning revelation came from chemical analysis of these preserved remains. Despite eating what modern people would consider inedible materials, the Vikings had maintained better nutrition during that crisis winter than many medieval populations enjoyed during normal times. They had achieved this through combinations of foods that modern nutritionists are only beginning to understand. Tree bark, it turns out, contains nutrients that complement grain proteins. Certain seaweeds provide vitamins that prevent deficiency diseases. Wild mushrooms offer proteins that meat-starved bodies desperately need. The Vikings hadn't just survived by eating anything they could find, they had survived by eating the right combinations of everything they could find. This knowledge came at a cost measured in lives.
Archaeological evidence suggests that this survival wisdom was built through generations of trial and error, with some families paying the ultimate price for mistaken choices. Burial sites from the early Viking Age contain skeletons that show clear signs of plant poisoning, nutritional deficiencies, and other diet-related deaths. Each tragedy became a lesson that surviving families remembered and passed on. The children who lived through these experiences grew up with an understanding of food that went far beyond simple hunger and satisfaction. They understood food as medicine, as security, as the foundation of everything else their culture achieved. The same Viking warriors who would later terrify Europe had learned their first and most important lessons not from weapons masters, but from the women who had kept them alive through winters that claimed weaker communities. This created a paradox that shaped Viking culture in ways historians are still discovering. The same people who lived on carefully rationed spoonfuls of gruel could, when fortune smiled, feast with an extravagance that shocked foreign observers. Medieval chroniclers describe Viking celebrations where entire herds of cattle were slaughtered, where rivers of ale flowed for days, where the abundance seemed to mock the very idea of scarcity. But this wasn't contradiction. It was strategy. Archaeological analysis of feast sites reveals something remarkable. Even during their most extravagant celebrations, Vikings wasted nothing. The massive bone deposits that mark these events show signs of systematic processing. Bones were cracked for marrow. Scraps were collected for later use. Even during abundance, the habits of survival remained. These feasts served multiple purposes beyond celebration. They were demonstrations of power, yes, but they were also massive food processing events. Whole communities would work together to preserve the bounty, transforming fresh meat into dried provisions, rendering fat into long-lasting cooking medium, preparing resources that would carry them through the next lean period. The women who had kept families alive through the hunger times became the coordinators of these preservation efforts. Their knowledge of salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation transformed temporary abundance into long-term security. The same hands that had carefully rationed grain through winter now supervised the creation of food stores that could last years. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Viking survival wasn't their techniques or their knowledge. It was their attitude toward food itself. In a culture where every meal was a victory over death, eating became a sacred act. The simple porridge that sustained families through winter was prepared with the same care and respect that warriors showed their weapons. This reverence for food created a culture where hospitality wasn't just politeness. It was the highest form of honor. To feed a guest was to share your family's survival. To waste food was to insult the memory of everyone who had died from hunger. To master the art of survival eating was to earn a status that no amount of gold could buy. The archaeological record shows that this attitude persisted even as Viking society grew wealthier and more complex. Even in the richest settlements, even among the most successful raiders, the basic survival foods remained central to daily life. Barley porridge appeared on tables alongside imported delicacies. Blood sausage was served at feasts that featured wine from distant lands. They never forgot where they came from. They never forgot what it took to survive. The scream that echoed across the Greenland settlement in 1002 CE wasn't from battle or childbirth. It was the sound of a mother discovering that her family's winter food stores had frozen solid, not preserved, but ruined by ice crystals that turned carefully hoarded grain into inedible mush. This was the moment when Viking survival knowledge faced its ultimate test. Greenland represented the bleeding edge of Viking expansion, where families had pushed human survival to its absolute limits. Here, 1,000 miles from the nearest reliable food source, the difference between life and death came down to understanding things that no human had ever needed to know before. How do you keep food from freezing when the temperature never rises above zero for 6 months? How do you find nutrition in a landscape where nothing green grows for most of the year? The answers they discovered would revolutionize everything we know about Viking survival. Eric the Red's colonists didn't just stumble into Greenland and hope for the best. Archaeological evidence reveals they brought with them the most advanced food preservation technology of their age, and then immediately began improving it under pressure that would have killed weaker peoples. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: failure. Early Greenland sites are littered with the remains of storage containers that didn't work. Clay pots that cracked in the extreme cold. Wooden barrels that split when their contents froze. Underground storage pits that filled with ice water. Each failure taught the colonists something crucial about their new environment, and each lesson was paid for with precious food that could never be replaced. But they learned fast. The solution they developed was so ingenious that modern Arctic explorers still use variations of it today. Instead of fighting the cold, they embraced it. They learned to control freezing rather than prevent it, creating the world's first systematic frozen food storage system. The key was understanding that not all freezing is the same. Rapid freezing creates small ice crystals that don't damage food structure. Slow freezing creates large crystals that destroy texture and nutrition. The Greenland Vikings discovered they could control this process by manipulating airflow, insulation, and storage container design. Archaeological excavations at the Western settlement have revealed storage chambers carved into permafrost, designed with ventilation systems that created precise temperature zones. Some areas kept food just above freezing for immediate use. Others maintained steady, sub-zero temperatures for long-term preservation. The most sophisticated chambers had multiple climate zones in the same space, allowing families to store different types of food under optimal conditions. But the real breakthrough wasn't technical. It was biological. The Greenland Vikings discovered that their own bodies were becoming part of the survival equation. Families who had lived in Greenland for generations developed physiological adaptations that helped them extract more nutrition from limited food sources. Their digestive systems became more efficient at processing the high-fat, high-protein diet that Greenland demanded. Their metabolisms adapted to function on fewer calories during the dark winter months. Archaeological analysis of human remains from Greenland Viking sites shows these adaptations in stunning detail. Bone density patterns that indicate bodies optimized for processing marine proteins. Tooth wear patterns that show systematic consumption of foods that mainland Vikings would have found inedible. Even brain chemistry that had adapted to function during months of darkness, when fresh food was impossible to obtain. This wasn't evolution, it was too fast for that. This was something more remarkable: human plasticity pushed to its limits by survival pressure. The children born in Greenland were different from their parents in measurable ways. They could digest seaweed proteins more efficiently. They could extract vitamins from foods that would leave mainland Vikings malnourished. They had developed what modern scientists would recognize as population-specific nutritional adaptations, biological changes that occurred within a single generation because survival demanded them. But these adaptations came with a cost that archaeologists are still uncovering. The remains of Greenland Viking children show signs of nutritional stress that would be considered severe by modern standards. Stunted growth, tooth defects, bone abnormalities. Clear evidence that even successful adaptation pushed human biology to its breaking point. These children survived, but they survived changed. The most haunting evidence comes from the settlement's final years. As the medieval warm period ended and temperatures dropped even further, the Viking survival system began to fail. Archaeological layers from the 14th century show increasingly desperate food choices. Bones from animals that had never been eaten before. Plant remains from species that were barely edible. Chemical signatures in the soil that suggest people were eating leather, processing bark, consuming anything that might provide a single calorie of energy. Yet even as their society collapsed, they maintained their survival discipline. The final food stores discovered at the Western settlement were still carefully organized. Ration portions laid out with mathematical precision. Inferior foods separated from better ones, suggesting that even in their last extremity, these people were trying to save the best for those who might need it most. Children, probably. Pregnant women. The people who represented the community's future, even when that future had already been decided. The last written record from Greenland Viking society is a simple inventory list, found carved into a piece of driftwood. It catalogs the remaining food supplies of what was probably a single family, 2 measures of dried fish, 1 small pot of rendered fat, seaweed sufficient for 10 days if stretched with bark flour. Below this, in a different hand, someone had added, "The children ate first." This wasn't just an accounting of resources. It was a moral statement that reveals everything about how Viking survival culture worked. Even when death was certain, the principles that had kept them alive for 3 centuries in one of Earth's most hostile environments remained unbroken. The community's survival knowledge, its understanding of nutrition and preservation and careful resource management, all served a single overriding purpose: protecting the next generation. The Greenland Vikings failed ultimately. Their settlements were abandoned, their people died or fled, their remarkable survival systems collapsed. But their failure teaches us something profound about the limits of human adaptability and the terrible mathematics of survival in impossible places. They had pushed survival science further than any previous human society. They had developed food preservation techniques centuries ahead of their time. They had adapted their own biology to extract life from resources that should have meant death. And still, it wasn't enough. The merchant's eyes widened in disbelief as he watched a Viking woman prepare what she called feast food from ingredients he would have fed to pigs. The year was 1067, and this Arab trader had witnessed the wealth of Baghdad, the sophistication of Constantinople, the abundance of wealthy European courts. But nothing had prepared him for this. She was making delicacies from scraps that would make a king weep with joy. This was the moment when the world discovered that Viking survival hadn't just created a people who could endure hardship. It had created master chefs whose understanding of flavor, nutrition, and food science surpassed anything the wealthy civilizations of the world had achieved. The transformation was stunning. The same techniques that had kept families alive during the worst winters in human memory had evolved into a cuisine so sophisticated that it would influence food culture across 2 continents. What began as desperate survival had become art. The Arab merchant, Ibn Fadlan's successor in the northern trade routes, recorded his amazement in detail. The Viking woman had taken fish that was nearly spoiled and transformed it through fermentation into something that surpassed the finest delicacies of the caliph's table. She had prepared blood pudding that was more satisfying than the richest dishes of Rome. Most remarkably, she had created a soup from bones and seaweed that provided more strength and health than could be found in a nobleman's feast. But this wasn't magic. It was the culmination of centuries of survival science that had pushed Viking food culture to heights that wouldn't be matched for another 1,000 years. The fermentation techniques they had developed to preserve fish through winter had created complex flavor profiles that modern food scientists are still trying to understand. The bacterial cultures they had learned to control weren't just preserving food. They were creating entirely new tastes, textures, and nutritional properties. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age fermentation vessels reveals a sophistication that rivals modern industrial food production. These weren't crude containers for emergency preservation. They were precision instruments designed to maintain specific bacterial environments, control acidity levels, and manage fermentation timing with mathematical precision. The knowledge required was staggering. Viking women had to understand the relationship between temperature, salt concentration, bacterial activity, and time in ways that wouldn't be formally documented by science for another 8 centuries. They had to recognize dozens of different bacterial smells, tastes, and visual indicators. They had to maintain multiple fermentation processes simultaneously, each requiring different conditions and timing. And they had to do all of this without any of the tools that modern food science considers essential. No thermometers, no pH testing, no sterile environments. Just knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that mastering fermentation meant the difference between their families living and dying. The results were extraordinary. The fermented fish that kept Viking families alive through winter weren't just preserved protein. They were probiotic superfoods that maintained digestive health during months when fresh food was impossible to obtain. The fermented dairy products they created were more nutritious than fresh milk and could be stored for years without spoiling. But perhaps most remarkably, they had learned to ferment vegetables in ways that created vitamin C concentrations high enough to prevent scurvy during the long months when no fresh plants were available. This wasn't just food preservation. It was nutritional enhancement that improved the health value of foods beyond what nature had originally provided. The merchants' records reveal something even more astonishing. The Viking woman wasn't just creating nutritious food. She was creating delicious food. The fermentation processes that had begun as survival necessities had evolved into sophisticated flavor development techniques that could transform the simplest ingredients into complex, satisfying meals. She was, in effect, practicing molecular gastronomy 1,000 years before the term was invented. The blood sausages that had sustained families through the darkest winters had become gourmet delicacies with flavor profiles that impressed traders from societies with access to spices from across the known world. The bone broths that had extracted every possible nutrient from animal remains had become complex, layered soups that provided both perfect nutrition and extraordinary taste. This transformation reveals something profound about human adaptability. When survival pressure forces people to become experts in any field, they don't just master the basics. They push beyond what anyone thought possible. The Vikings hadn't just learned to preserve food adequately. They had become the most advanced food scientists of their age. The knowledge they had developed was spreading across Europe through trade routes, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. Archaeological evidence shows Viking fermentation techniques appearing in settlements across the North Sea, the Baltic, and even the Mediterranean. The survival science that had been born in Scandinavian longhouses was revolutionizing food culture across continents. But the most remarkable discovery came from an unexpected source. The Vikings themselves were astonished by what they had achieved. Runic inscriptions from the late Viking Age include what appear to be recipes and food preparation notes. But when linguists translated them, they found something surprising. The Vikings were documenting their own food culture with the same wonder that foreign merchants expressed. They had become so sophisticated in their survival techniques that they were amazed by their own capabilities. One inscription, found in Iceland, reads, "The winter that should have killed us instead taught us to eat like gods." Another, from Norway, "What our grandmothers learned from hunger, our daughters have made into glory." These weren't just descriptions of food. They were celebrations of human ingenuity, expressions of pride in achievements that had grown from the darkest circumstances into something that bordered on miraculous. The final transformation was philosophical. The Vikings had started with a simple goal: don't starve. They had achieved something far greater. They had learned that the deepest appreciation of food, the most sophisticated understanding of nutrition, and the most complex flavor development could only come from people who truly understood what it meant to be hungry. Their survival had taught them that every meal was precious. This appreciation had driven them to perfect every aspect of food preparation, to waste nothing, to transform even the humblest ingredients into something worthy of the gratitude they felt simply to be alive. The merchant concluded his account with an observation that reveals the profound impact of what he had witnessed. These northern people have learned secrets of nourishment that the richest kingdoms of the world have never imagined. They eat like emperors from the food of peasants, and they do so with more joy than any feast I have seen in the greatest palaces. The Vikings had achieved the impossible. They had turned survival into art, necessity into pleasure, and desperation into a cuisine that would influence human food culture for the next 1,000 years. They had learned that the greatest luxury isn't abundance. It's the knowledge to create abundance from anything. The wooden bowl trembled in the old woman's hands as she ladled out what might be the last meal her family would ever share. But Astrid Eriksdotter wasn't trembling from fear. She was shaking with rage. After 60 years of keeping her people alive through famines, raids, and the worst winters in living memory, she refused to let her knowledge die with her. The year was 1347, and the Black Death was sweeping across Europe like a hungry beast. But in the remote fjords of Norway, something even more devastating was happening. The young people were forgetting. The same generation that had grown comfortable with trade goods and imported luxuries was losing the survival wisdom that had kept their ancestors alive for centuries. They bought bread instead of growing barley. They traded for preserved meat instead of learning to cure their own. They had forgotten that comfort was temporary, but knowledge was forever. Astrid's granddaughter had just asked her why they needed to know how to make blood sausage when they could simply buy meat from traveling merchants. The question hit Astrid like a physical blow. In that moment, she realized that the greatest threat to Viking survival wasn't starvation, disease, or enemy armies. It was prosperity. The very success of their survival systems had created a generation that didn't understand why those systems existed. But Astrid was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. She began with a story that seemed like ancient history to her comfortable granddaughter. The winter of 1258, when volcanic ash from distant mountains had blocked the sun for months, killing crops across Scandinavia. The young woman had heard this tale before, but she had never understood what it really meant. Astrid's family had survived that catastrophe by eating foods that her granddaughter couldn't even imagine consuming. Tree bark ground into flour, leather boiled into gelatin, seaweed gathered from frozen shores where waves crashed like hammers against ice. Not just survived, thrived, because they understood things about nutrition and food science that the wealthy kingdoms of Europe had never learned. The lesson began simply. Astrid handed her granddaughter a handful of barley grains and asked her to make porridge. The girl's first attempt was a disaster. Watery, flavorless, barely edible. She had never learned the precise ratios of grain to water, the importance of cooking temperature, the timing that could transform simple ingredients into nourishing food. But Astrid wasn't teaching cooking. She was teaching survival. Each mistake became a lesson about why their ancestors had developed such precise techniques. Too much water meant the precious grain would provide less nutrition. Too little meant the porridge would burn, wasting fuel that might be impossible to replace. Wrong temperature meant bacterial growth that could poison the family. Wrong timing meant food that would spoil before it could be eaten. The granddaughter began to understand. Every rule, every technique, every seemingly arbitrary tradition had been paid for with human lives. The precise measurements weren't customs. They were scientific formulas developed through generations of trial and error, where errors meant death. Astrid's real lesson was just beginning. She led the girl to the family's storage rooms, spaces that had seemed boring and old-fashioned to someone who expected food to simply appear when needed. But now, with new eyes, the granddaughter began to see these rooms differently. They weren't just storage, they were laboratories. different types of containers for different preservation needs, specific locations chosen for precise temperature and humidity control, rotation systems that ensured older food was used before it spoiled, backup supplies hidden in locations that raiders or natural disasters couldn't reach. Every detail had been designed by people who understood that food security wasn't luck, it was science. The most profound revelation came when Astrid showed her granddaughter the family seed stores. These weren't just next year's crops. They were genetic libraries, carefully maintained varieties of grains and vegetables that had been selected over centuries for their ability to grow in harsh conditions, resist disease, and provide maximum nutrition from poor soil. Some of these seeds hadn't been planted in decades, but they were still viable, still capable of growing into plants that could save lives during catastrophes that hadn't happened yet. The granddaughter realized she was looking at a form of wealth that no amount of silver could buy. The biological foundation of her family's survival, preserved through generations of careful stewardship. But Astrid's most important lesson was about community. She explained how Viking survival had never been an individual achievement. The preservation techniques, the fermentation knowledge, the understanding of wild foods, all of it had been shared freely among families because everyone understood that their survival depended on their neighbor's survival. When one family's food stores failed, others shared. When someone discovered a new preservation technique, it spread through the community like news of victory in battle. When children showed aptitude for food preparation, they were taught by the most skilled practitioners, regardless of family connections. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. A community where everyone understood survival techniques was a community that could endure anything. A community where knowledge was hoarded or lost was a community doomed to perish when the inevitable disaster struck. The granddaughter's education intensified as Astrid revealed the deeper secrets of Viking food culture. She learned about the relationship between nutrition and immunity, how certain fermented foods could prevent diseases that killed people in wealthier societies. She discovered the psychological aspects of survival eating, how the right foods could maintain mental health during the dark months when depression and despair claimed more lives than starvation. Most remarkably, she began to understand the spiritual dimensions of survival knowledge. The Vikings hadn't just learned to extract nutrition from impossible sources. They had learned to find meaning, community, and even joy in the process of staying alive under conditions that should have crushed human spirit. The lesson culminated when Astrid revealed the family's most closely guarded secret, a complete survival manual, carved in runes on wooden tablets and hidden in a sealed container. This wasn't just recipes or techniques. It was a comprehensive guide to maintaining human life under any conditions, developed through centuries of accumulated wisdom. The manual contained information that wouldn't be rediscovered by formal science for another 500 years. Detailed understanding of bacterial fermentation, precise nutritional requirements for human health, complex preservation chemistry, even psychological techniques for maintaining hope and community during extended hardships. But as Astrid handed these priceless tablets to her granddaughter, she delivered the most important lesson of all. Knowledge without practice dies. Understanding without application becomes myth. Wisdom without teaching disappears forever. The granddaughter finally understood why her grandmother had been so angry. The Viking survival systems weren't museum pieces or historical curiosities. They were living technologies that required active maintenance, constant practice, and deliberate transmission from one generation to the next. In forgetting these systems, her generation hadn't just lost convenient skills. They had lost the foundation of their civilization's resilience, the knowledge that had made their people capable of surviving anything. The archaeologist's hand stopped trembling as she realized what she was holding. In a frozen pit beneath a collapsed Greenland farmhouse, Dr. Sarachun had just discovered something that would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about Viking survival. It wasn't treasure. It wasn't weapons. It was a cookbook. But this wasn't just any cookbook. Carbon dating would later confirm that these wooden tablets, preserved in permafrost for over 600 years, contained the most complete survival manual ever created by any human civilization. They held secrets that could save lives today. The first tablet Shun translated contained instructions for creating vitamin C from pine needles, a technique that could have prevented scurvy for every Arctic explorer who had died from that disease. The second described bacterial fermentation processes that modern food scientists were still trying to perfect. The third contained nutritional formulas that were more accurate than anything developed until the 20th century. But the fourth tablet contained something that made Chin's breath catch in her throat. It was a message, written in the final years of the Greenland colony, addressed to whoever might find these tablets in the future. The message was simple, desperate, and profound. We failed, but our knowledge must not die with us. Learn from what we learned. Survive better than we survived. This was the moment when the full scope of Viking survival achievement became clear. They hadn't just developed techniques for staying alive in harsh conditions. They had created a complete science of human resilience that was centuries ahead of its time, and they had deliberately preserved it for future generations who might need it. The tablets revealed the true sophistication of Viking survival systems. What seemed like simple folk knowledge was actually advanced biochemistry, understood through empirical observation and refined through generations of testing. The Vikings had identified bacterial strains, controlled fermentation environments, and managed nutritional chemistry with precision that wouldn't be matched by formal science until the modern era. But the most stunning revelation came from the final tablets, which contained something unprecedented in historical records: systematic documentation of survival psychology. The Vikings had recognized that physical survival techniques were useless without mental and emotional resilience. They had developed specific practices for maintaining hope during extended hardships, methods for preserving community bonds when resources were scarce, and psychological techniques for making rational decisions under extreme stress. These weren't just observations, they were tested methodologies. The tablets described specific rituals, stories, and social practices that had been proven to help people endure conditions that broke other communities. They had learned to treat mental health as seriously as physical health, understanding that both were essential for survival. The implications were staggering. Modern psychologists studying trauma, resilience, and crisis management were discovering that many of their most effective techniques had been pioneered by Viking communities centuries earlier. The same people who had mastered fermentation and food preservation had also mastered the human mind's capacity for endurance. Chin's discovery sparked a revolution in archaeological research. Teams began searching for similar knowledge caches at Viking sites across the world, and what they found changed everything. From Iceland to Newfoundland, from the Shetland Islands to the rivers of Russia, Viking communities have been systematically documenting and preserving their survival knowledge. Not just the techniques themselves, but the reasoning behind them, the experimental process that had led to their development, and the conditions under which they worked best. This wasn't coincidence, it was deliberate policy. Archaeological evidence revealed that Viking communities had developed a formal system for preserving knowledge across generations, ensuring that hard-won survival wisdom couldn't be lost to war, disease, or cultural change. The system was remarkably sophisticated. Knowledge was encoded in multiple formats. Practical training passed down through families, formal documentation in runes, artistic representations in carvings and metalwork, even songs and stories that contained precise technical information disguised as entertainment. But the most important discovery was that this knowledge hadn't died with the Viking Age. It had survived, evolved, and spread throughout the world, influencing food culture, preservation techniques, and survival practices far beyond Scandinavia. Modern researchers began tracing the genetic lineage of Viking survival techniques through European, American, and even Asian food traditions. The fermentation methods that had kept Norse families alive through impossible winters had become the foundation of food preservation systems that fed millions of people around the world. The blood sausages that had seemed like desperate survival measures were revealed to be sophisticated nutritional engineering, creating complete protein sources from materials that would otherwise be wasted. Modern food scientists studying these techniques found that they were more efficient and more nutritious than many contemporary processed foods. But perhaps the most profound legacy was philosophical. The Viking understanding that survival required community, knowledge sharing, and long-term thinking had influenced the development of cooperative societies, scientific research methods, and emergency preparedness systems that shaped human civilization. The final revelation came when researchers realized that Viking survival knowledge was still actively saving lives. The fermentation techniques developed in medieval Scandinavia have been adapted by modern disaster relief organizations working in refugee camps and crisis zones. The psychological resilience methods documented in those ancient tablets were being used by therapists treating trauma victims and military personnel dealing with extreme stress. The nutritional science that had kept Viking families alive during the worst famines in European history was being applied to combat malnutrition in developing countries. The resource management systems that had allowed Viking communities to thrive in impossibly harsh environments were being studied by engineers developing sustainable living technologies. Chin's discovery had proven something remarkable. The Vikings hadn't just survived. They had learned to survive so well that their knowledge could help humanity face any crisis. Climate change, natural disasters, economic collapse, social disruption. The same principles that had kept Norse communities alive for centuries contained solutions to the challenges facing modern civilization. The message carved in those final tablets had been fulfilled. The Vikings had failed to maintain their specific civilization, but their knowledge hadn't died with them. It had been preserved, discovered, and shared with a world that desperately needed to learn from their experience. The last tablet Chun translated contained one final message, written by someone who had clearly known they were among the last Vikings in Greenland. We learned that survival is not about being strong enough to endure anything. It is about being wise enough to prepare for everything. As researchers continue to study these remarkable discoveries, they keep finding new applications for ancient Viking wisdom. Food scientists, psychologists, community organizers, disaster relief specialists, and environmental engineers all find valuable insights in techniques developed by people who understood that survival was humanity's highest art. The Vikings had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had not only survived in conditions that should have been impossible for human life, they had thrived, created beauty, built lasting communities, and preserved knowledge that would benefit humanity for centuries after their own civilization had ended. Their greatest victory wasn't conquest or exploration. It was the simple, profound achievement of learning to turn survival into art, necessity into wisdom, and desperation into a legacy that would help human beings face whatever challenges the future might bring. The Vikings had eaten to survive, but in learning to survive, they had taught the world how to live.